The darkest details of Jeffrey Epstein's case never made it into the news. They were buried before they could surface. Surely, you know the official version. He used his private plane to transport celebrities, politicians, and businessmen to a remote island in the Caribbean, where young girls with a very specific profile awaited them. It wasn't just their age that was disturbing, it was something far more sinister. But if we dig a little deeper, we discover the island was just the tip of the iceberg. This was happening in New York, London, Florida, Paris, and more. It was a network of trafficking innocents to serve the elite. How did he manage to hide it for so long? With one system to silence the victims and another to control the powerful. Epstein used techniques that, according to little-known sources, he may have learned from the Mossad, Israel's intelligence service. This is just one of many details you'll almost never see in major media, because there was a lot they tried to bury. Today, we'll uncover everything they never dared to show us. Where did his fortune really come from? Why did the entire system protect him? And did he truly commit suicide, or did someone make him disappear? As we go along, we'll count how many crimes he committed and how many he got away with. See if you can guess the number at the end. Jeffrey Epstein was born in 1953 in Brooklyn, New York, into a middle-class Jewish family. His father, Seymour, was a laborer and gardener, and his mother, Paula, worked as a school assistant. A childhood friend of Jeffrey's commented that Paula was a wonderfully devoted mother despite her full-time job, and neighbors described the family as the kindest people. Jeffrey grew up in a quiet, private neighborhood, described by some as a middle-class refuge. From a young age, he showed a remarkable aptitude for mathematics and classical piano. He was so intelligent that he skipped 2 grades and finished high school at 16. Friends from that time remember him as sweet and generous, though also quiet and somewhat nerdy. They called him AP. A childhood friend described him as an average kid, very good at math, a bit overweight, with freckles, and always smiling in photos from those years. According to journalist Ari Feldman, he had a calm expression and soft features, nothing like the arrogant smile he'd later become known for. So far, Jeffrey's childhood seems unremarkable, perhaps even quite peaceful and pleasant. So how does someone with a childhood like that end up becoming a predator? Epstein enrolled in college to study mathematical physiology, but never graduated. It's at age 21, right around then, that the first red flags begin to appear. Without finishing college, he landed a job as a math teacher at the Dalton School, a private institution in Manhattan where children of some of the country's wealthiest families attended. Several former students recall his behavior as highly inappropriate. He paid excessive attention to underage female students and even attended parties where he openly flirted with them. Here we find his first questionable act without consequences. In a school meeting, Epstein's intelligence so impressed the father of one of his students that the man recommended him to Alan Greenberg, CEO of Bear Stearns, one of Wall Street's most prominent and respected investment firms at the time. That connection changed his life forever. Afterward, Epstein was fired from the school for poor performance, but Greenberg didn't hesitate to offer him a job at Bear Stearns. He started as a junior assistant to a stock trader, but quickly stood out. He had a talent for dealing with millionaire clients and devising strategies to minimize their taxes. Here we see his second questionable act, operating in the gray area of legality. Did he face any consequences? No, quite the opposite. They rewarded him, making him a limited partner. However, not long after, he slipped up in one of his financial moves. Epstein broke a law, forcing the firm to fire him. He then founded his own consulting company, sometimes working for governments or millionaires to recover money lost in financial frauds, and other times working for those who had stolen it. Did he face any sanctions? On the contrary, he benefited. Through that business, he met so many powerful people that he became even more untouchable. It's worth pausing here. As far as we know, Jeffrey's childhood was seemingly normal. He grew up in a hardworking, even affectionate family, in a quiet neighborhood. His friends remember him as sweet and a brilliant student. But little by little, his story begins to twist, starting with his behavior toward underage female students. At the time, there wasn't a clear crime, nothing too scandalous, but there were worrying signs. Inappropriate comments, excessive attention to certain girls, even attending parties where he flirted with them. Maybe it wasn't illegal, but it was clearly inappropriate. The students noticed it, they remember it to this day. And yet, no one said anything. Then came his skill at dodging the law. At Bear Stearns, he became an expert at finding legal loopholes to help clients pay less in taxes. That wasn't a crime or unusual on Wall Street, but what matters isn't what he did, it's what it taught him. That bending the rules, as long as you don't get caught, isn't just acceptable but rewarded. They gave him promotions, made him a partner, and surrounded him with powerful people. And so, with each experience, Jeffrey learned that crossing the line, as long as no one stopped him, was not only okay, but advantageous. And if no one breaks you, on the contrary, they reward you. Why stop? Social psychologist Roy Baumeister explains that almost all of us have 3 misconceptions about what evil really is. First, we tend to think people are inherently good or bad, as if it's part of their DNA. Under that logic, someone good can't do anything wrong, and someone bad is doomed to always act with malice. Second, We often believe that evil mostly comes from sociopaths or psychopaths, people without empathy, guilt, or a soul, as if they were a separate species. Third, many movies have led us to believe that evil stems from a single traumatic event in childhood, as if something breaks inside a person, and from then on, there's no turning back. But Baumeister says the reality is much more complex, and to understand it, we must break with those ideas. To start, the vast majority of cruel acts aren't committed by psychopaths or sociopaths. Only about 5% of these cases seem to come from people who genuinely enjoy causing harm. The other 95% apparently come from ordinary people who don't see themselves as evil or cruel, but simply act out of desire, impulse, or convenience. He also makes it clear that morality isn't something we're born with. A baby doesn't know what's right or wrong. If it wants a toy, it takes it. If something bothers it, it might bite or push. It's not malice. It's because no one has taught it otherwise. It's suggested that morality is learned over time through what parents, teachers, and society teach. If no one explains that stealing is wrong, it's likely you won't see it as a problem growing up. Not necessarily because you were born evil, but because you were never taught to distinguish. Moreover, morality isn't formed only during childhood. It's not a chip installed when we're young that never changes. Every decision we make, big or small, adjusts that moral compass. In Jeffrey's case, perhaps his parents did teach him that breaking the law is wrong. But if, time and again, he experienced situations where breaking rules not only had no consequences but brought rewards, his internal compass may have deviated, not all at once, but little by little. So, being good or bad isn't a fixed category, something you decide once and it's done. It's something built over time through decisions. And what does all this mean? That while it would be easier to label Epstein as a simple sociopath, the truth is much more uncomfortable. It's very likely he wasn't born a monster. He was an ordinary person who, over time, crossed boundaries and never faced consequences. And so, he kept yielding more to his impulses. And since no one stopped him, on the contrary, they rewarded him, he kept advancing. That's chilling because if Epstein had been just a sociopath, we could rest easy thinking it was an isolated case. But if he wasn't, it implies that many other people, if they knew they'd never be punished, might also be capable of the same. And it seems that's what happened. Epstein's mansions became meeting points for some of the world's most powerful men, politicians, businessmen, royalty, who used their power, money, and influence to do whatever they wanted with whomever they wanted, knowing no one would touch them. Epstein began working with clients increasingly involved in dark operations. One of them was Adnan Khashoggi, a billionaire businessman who secretly helped the U.S. government under President Ronald Reagan to send arms to Iran, something that was completely illegal at the time. But that wasn't all. The money Iran paid for those arms was diverted by the president himself to fund the Contras, a rebel group in Nicaragua trying to overthrow the regime, also prohibited by the U.S. Congress. Did anyone face sanctions? Of course not. When the government changed, the new president pardoned them, because he was also implicated. Other Epstein clients were involved in espionage and money laundering. He traveled constantly between the U.S., Europe, and the Middle East, especially to countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, suggesting he wasn't just a financial advisor, but personally involved in those operations, and, of course, earning handsomely from them. During this period, Epstein told several people he worked as an intelligence agent. Some believe it was pure invention, but evidence has surfaced. He had a fake passport with his photo, a different name, and an address in Saudi Arabia. Journalists like Howard Cohen and Robertson have directly linked him to the Mossad, Israel's intelligence service, known for espionage, infiltrations, and covert eliminations. According to these sources, Epstein gathered compromising information on powerful people to blackmail them later. We'll see how this skill for obtaining sensitive information was key to building and maintaining his power. In 1987, Epstein began working with Stephen Hoffenberg, a financial fraudster, on a new project, Towers Financial. The model was simple. They convinced people to invest their money, promising sky-high returns, but it was all a lie. The company didn't generate real profits. It just used new investors' money to pay off the previous ones, a classic Ponzi scheme. Meanwhile, they pocketed millions, traveled on private jets, and lived a life of luxury. When the fraud was uncovered, it was revealed as one of the largest in U.S. history, with theft equivalent to nearly $1 billion in today's dollars. Since Epstein had left the company a few years earlier, he faced no charges. In 1988, Jeffrey Epstein founded his own financial firm, J. Epstein and Company. He claimed to only accept clients with over $1 billion, but something doesn't add up. To this day, there's no proof of these supposed clients. No records, contracts, or names except one. Les Wexner, owner of L Brands, the company behind Victoria's Secret. This is important because Wexner is technically the only verifiable reason Epstein became so rich. He likely earned much more through fraud, blackmail, or possible espionage dealings. But since all that happened in the shadows, Wexner is the only public link to his illegal fortune. Epstein became Wexner's trusted financial advisor, his right-hand man. In 1991, Wexner did something highly unusual. He gave Epstein full legal power over his money, meaning Epstein could sign checks, buy properties, and make financial decisions as if he were the owner. How much did Epstein earn working with Wexner? There's no official figure, but we can make a reasonable estimate. Wexner's fortune is close to $6 billion, according to Forbes. In the financial world, advisors to large fortunes typically charge between 0.5% and 1% of the total they manage annually. If Epstein charged 1%, that would be $8 million a year. Additionally, Wexner transferred high-value properties to him, including a Manhattan mansion valued at over $70 million. But this wasn't just any mansion. It was possibly the largest private residence in Manhattan, located between Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue, one of New York's most exclusive and expensive areas. However, this mansion would become the scene of multiple abuses, where dozens of young girls entered without knowing what they were really getting into. Adding it all up, it's estimated Epstein earned at least $200 million through his relationship with Wexner. But even that fell short because, when everything came to light, Wexner claimed Epstein had defrauded him, stealing $46 million. Starting with his relationship with Wexner, Epstein began moving in increasingly exclusive circles. He attended Victoria's Secret fashion shows, dated models, and surrounded himself with high-profile figures like Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, and Prince Andrew. In fact, Trump once said, "Jeff's a terrific guy. It's fun to be with him. They say he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side." No doubt Jeffrey enjoys his social life. He'd probably give anything to erase that quote today. That same year Wexner made him his right-hand man, Epstein had another key encounter. He met Ghislaine Maxwell. Ghislaine was the daughter of Robert Maxwell, a British tycoon known for his extravagant lifestyle, mansions, private helicopters, luxury yachts. But behind all that opulence, there was something shady. When Robert died under highly suspicious circumstances, it came to light that he had stolen over £400 million from his own company's pension funds while living a life of excess, leaving thousands of employees without their life savings. It was one of the biggest financial scandals of the time, and the Maxwell family fell into public disgrace. Ghislaine, who had grown up surrounded by privilege, suddenly lost everything: the fortune, the status, and access to the elite, until she met Epstein, a man with money, connections, and, like her father, no qualms about engaging in shady business. At first, Epstein and Ghislaine had a romantic relationship, and she became his right-hand woman in all personal matters. She organized his schedule, supervised household staff, coordinated parties, and introduced him to influential people. In return, Epstein helped her maintain the lifestyle she'd always known, even buying her an apartment in New York just blocks from his mansion. It was during this time that things started getting truly dark. Though most associate the abuses with Epstein's island, it all began much earlier in his New York apartment, where they began defining their operating method. It's not entirely clear how it started, but what we do know is that from 1991, Epstein began using his power and contacts to attract young girls. He leveraged his Victoria's Secret connection to make them believe he could get them modeling jobs. Of course, once they entered his apartment, you can imagine what really happened. However, what began as isolated encounters soon turned into something far more perverse. Together with Ghislaine, they created a system, a manual on how to approach girls, what to say, and how to gain their trust. It wasn't sporadic anymore, it was a system. And not only that, they even hired a girl to execute this method. In court records, she appears under the name Tiffany. She testified that from 1991 to 2000, for 9 years, that was her job, recruiting girls for Epstein. And whom were they targeting? The most vulnerable, girls from broken families with histories of abuse, addiction, or abandonment, with no money or home, or simply alone in the city with no one to protect them. Yes, they all had something in common. They were far too young, so young that young girls wouldn't even be the appropriate term. The right word would be children, but to avoid alarming the algorithm, let's say young girls, and you know what I mean. According to Jane Doe's testimony, she was recruited at just 13. Tiffany approached her, saying Jeffrey was looking for models to try on clothes or participate in photo shoots, mentioning it was under the Victoria's Secret brand and that it could lead to fashion industry contacts. The informal interview would take place at Epstein's apartment, where they'd give her more details and teach her how to prepare. Once at the mansion, she was taken to a room where Epstein forced her into intimate acts. This formula was repeated time and again. However, what started as something just for Jeffrey soon became a service offered to his closest friends. And I repeat, it wasn't casual anymore, but a perfectly organized operation. Years later, notes were found in Epstein's properties with messages like, "She says she can be there at 2 because she has school," or "I even have one 6 by 2 for 4, meaning a 12-year-old for 4 p.m. And so, Epstein's mansion became a place where powerful men gathered to commit reprehensible acts with young girls. These men made it very clear they had power, money, and connections, and that if anyone spoke out, they or their families would pay the consequences. This continued for years until, in 1996, Maria Farmer dared to report it. Maria had met Epstein during one of her art exhibitions. Months later, he offered her a job as a receptionist at his New York apartment. You can imagine how many young girls Maria saw entering, personally escorted by Ghislaine. On one occasion, Epstein showed her the security cameras installed throughout the house. Maria noticed many were placed in private areas, bathrooms, bedrooms, dressing rooms. It didn't seem like a normal security system. It looked more like a way to monitor and possibly record everything that happened there. For what purpose? Almost certainly to gather material for leverage or blackmail. This detail is key to understanding everything that followed. As mentioned earlier, there's a theory that before becoming famous, Epstein may have worked with the Mossad, Israel's secret service. There's no definitive proof, but several sources suggest he could have been a collaborator or informant. And why would this be important? Because the Mossad, like many intelligence agencies, has been known to use a highly effective method to control powerful figures: blackmail. They lure them into compromising situations, record them, and then use that material as leverage or protection. So, if Epstein was indeed recording what happened with his guests, that could be the key to how he got away with it for so long. If he had politicians, businessmen, or celebrities caught on tape in delicate situations, it stripped them of any chance to betray him. And if anyone dared to turn on him, he had the means to silence them. In 1996, Maria was working on an artwork Epstein had commissioned. One day, while staying at one of his properties, Ghislaine entered her room and said, "Jeffrey would like you to give him a foot massage." Maria found it strange, but didn't know how to say no. Then Epstein asked her to sit next to him on the bed. She hesitated, but did it. Ghislaine sat on the other side, and together they began touching her. Maria wanted to run, but she was paralyzed. While Epstein groped her, Ghislaine tried to calm her, stroking her arm and whispering that everything was fine. After that, Maria called the New York police and the FBI to report the assault. The agents took her statement and seemed genuinely concerned, but days passed, and nothing happened. For some reason, the complaint against Epstein was buried, as if it had never existed. By 2000, Epstein was famous in New York's most exclusive circles, appearing at galas, private events, and art auctions. But there was something odd. Everyone knew his name, but no one could say exactly what he did. He claimed to be a financial advisor, but no one could name a single client. In that context, Vanity Fair decided to profile him. The assigned journalist was Vicky Ward, and from the first meeting, something didn't add up. Epstein wanted to control everything: what photos were used, what words were published. He insisted on projecting an image of a philanthropist and academic, surrounded by science, art, and prestige. But the more Vicky dug, the more inconsistencies she found. One day, she came across a name: Maria Farmer. And not just her, her younger sister, Annie, had also been a victim. Vicky interviewed them, confirmed the details, and put together a solid report. But before publishing, journalistic protocol required contacting Epstein and giving him a chance to respond. Jeffrey not only refused, he called Vanity Fair's editor-in-chief, Graydon Carter, demanding it not be published. Then the gifts arrived. First, a dead cat's head, then a bullet. When the article was finally released, the Farmer sisters were no longer in it. Their testimonies had been removed, and the title that remained was The Talented Mr. Epstein. Over time, the network of abuses didn't just continue. It became more sophisticated. Now his base was in Palm Beach, and that wasn't a coincidence. Palm Beach is an island separated from the rest of Florida, connected by just a few bridges, a secluded, almost inaccessible place, perfect for hiding what was really going on. The most disturbing part is that his mansion was just minutes from a much humbler area, the ideal hunting ground for finding vulnerable girls with economic or emotional needs that Epstein knew exactly how to exploit. By then, this was no longer just one woman recruiting, but a full network. He had girls infiltrating low-income high schools, asking them to identify other young girls who seemed needy. Then they'd approach them with an offer. One earned $200 for a 30-minute massage. They were desperate, and it was easy money. So many accepted. But upon arriving at the house, they found Jeffrey fully naked on the massage table. What happened next? We can imagine. At the end, Jeffrey would say, "Here's your $200, and another $200 for the girl who brought you." This went on for years until, in 2005, a young girl confided in her stepmother that a wealthy man had touched her. The woman called the police and mentioned she suspected her stepdaughter wasn't the only one. The police investigated Epstein for over a year, but along the way, Michael Ryder, the police chief, noticed something troubling. Barry Krischer, the state attorney, the person representing the state and deciding what charges to file, was being too lenient with the case. So, Ryder escalated it and requested FBI assistance. They found photos of minors, sadomasochism books, and employee testimonies stating Epstein received massages up to 3 times a day. They uncovered data on girls recruited from South America and Europe, including triplets aged 12 brought from France for Epstein's birthday and returned the next day after being used by him. The FBI identified 34 young girls as direct victims. The Palm Beach police established that Epstein should be charged with 4 counts of illegal relations with minors and 1 count of abuse. Michael, the police chief, was convinced he'd be convicted. There was too much evidence. However, Krischer, the prosecutor, made a decision no one understood. Instead of pressing charges and taking Epstein to trial, he sent the case to a grand jury. A grand jury is a group of citizens who review evidence and decide if there's enough to formally accuse someone. But this process, done behind closed doors, is often used, as everyone knew, to soften charges or avoid harsh convictions. And that's what happened, taken to an extreme. Epstein ended up charged with only a minor count of soliciting prostitution, nothing for abusing young girls, though the vast majority were 14 or 15. The FBI wasn't satisfied and opened a new investigation, managing to file a more comprehensive formal accusation. But once again, the case fell to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, Alex Acosta, and once again, there was a deal. Epstein agreed to plead guilty to 2 serious prostitution charges, and Acosta granted him full immunity from any federal criminal charges. Years later, Acosta justified his decision, saying he'd been warned that Epstein belonged to intelligence, that he was out of his league, and that it was better not to interfere. The sentence was a mockery, just 18 months in jail, and not even that was served properly. He didn't go to a regular prison, but to a county jail with much softer conditions. Within weeks, he was granted special permission to leave 6 days a week, up to 12 hours a day, supposedly to work at his office. In other words, he only slept in jail and spent his days out. In the end, he served just 13 of the 18 months and was released on a year's probation, meaning he couldn't leave the state, had to register as a sex offender, and couldn't approach minors. And what happened? He traveled on his private jet, visited his properties in New York and the Virgin Islands, and, according to later witnesses, returned to doing exactly the same: recruiting, paying, abusing, and covering it up. As if that weren't enough, Epstein still had time for more. He played a key role in the 2008 financial crisis, the one that left millions without homes, jobs, or savings. It wasn't enough for him to ruin lives in private. He also helped sink the global economy. Between 2000 and 2007, Epstein was president of a company called Liquid Funding, which lent money to banks and other financial institutions. Up to that point, everything seemed normal. But under his leadership, they introduced a supposed innovation. They began accepting different types of collateral to secure those loans. Previously, solid assets like stocks or bonds were used, but Epstein's company started accepting mortgage-backed securities, essentially debts from ordinary people paying off their homes in installments. The logic was that if people kept paying monthly, the loan was secure. But there was a big problem. Many of those mortgages were risky, given to people who likely couldn't keep up with payments, yet they were sold as safe investments. And then the inevitable happened. Thousands stopped paying their mortgages, and those collaterals became worthless. The whole system collapsed, banks failed, the market crashed, and thus began the 2008 crisis. Of course, Epstein wasn't the only culprit, but he certainly helped build one of the key pieces of the disaster. And, as in almost everything he did, he emerged unscathed, with no one to stop him. He took his operation to the next level, a remote island in the Caribbean called Little St. James. Aboard his private jet, Epstein, his accomplices, and his guests transported young girls, some from the US, others from Europe and South America. Once on the island, the victims were isolated with no way to leave, while Epstein and his guests used them as part of their entertainment. And who were those guests? Well, the list suggests Bill Clinton, Kevin Spacey, Prince Andrew, Chris Tucker, Alan Dershowitz, and many more. Of course, it must be said that being on the island doesn't automatically mean they committed a crime. In fact, an electrician who worked there said that while he saw several men with young girls, others just ate, chatted, and left. What this information does reveal is who maintained a relationship with Epstein even after accusations of abusing young girls and his official registration as a sex offender became public, and, unfortunately, also during his abuses. But in 2015, something changed. Virginia Roberts had the courage to file a lawsuit, claiming that at just 15, she had been recruited by Epstein and Ghislaine to be a sex slave. She was pressured into having relations with Prince Andrew. Her statements became international news, and though sadly nothing legal came of it, something very important did happen. Many women who saw what Virginia did began to think that perhaps they could speak out too. That's how, in 2016, a woman identified as Katie Johnson filed another lawsuit, recounting that at 13, she had been lured to Epstein's parties with promises of money and a modeling career. She claims that Donald Trump, then a candidate for U.S. president, beat and forced her, after which Epstein did the same. This accusation was a media bombshell. The public began to wonder how deep the reach of Epstein's abuses and his inner circles was. But once again, justice didn't move forward. Katie received so many threats that she was forced to withdraw the lawsuit. However, Julie Brown, a reporter for the Miami Herald, didn't let go. For over a year, she tracked down thousands of court documents, many sealed or conveniently lost, finding testimonies, police reports, and evidence that had never been used to bring Epstein to justice as he deserved. She located several victims, interviewed them, and confirmed that at least 80 young girls had been abused, though it was later estimated that there might have been more. Finally, in 2018, Brown published her investigation, Perversion of Justice. It was the turning point. The scandal exploded, and public pressure grew so much that the federal prosecutor had no choice. They reopened the case, and on July 6, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. This time, the accusations reflected what he had really done, trafficking young girls. He was immediately transferred to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, a supposedly maximum security federal prison. They searched his mansion and found hundreds, perhaps thousands, of photos of unclothed women, some minors. In a safe, they discovered compact discs labeled with details of which young girl had been with which man, a detailed record of each encounter, almost certainly for blackmail and control. They also found $70,000 in cash, 48 diamonds, and a fake Austrian passport, all ready for a potential escape if needed. 2 days later, the formal accusation arrived. The minimum sentence was 45 years in prison, and for a 66-year-old like Epstein, that was essentially a life sentence. A week later, the case erupted even more. Hundreds of pages of evidence were released, testimonies, private jet flight logs, and the most explosive part, the names of politicians, businessmen, and public figures also involved. On July 18, Epstein attempted to get bail, meaning to stay at his Manhattan mansion while awaiting trial. He offered $500 million, house arrest, and an electronic bracelet for monitoring. But the judge denied it. With his history, connections, and money, it was clear they couldn't give him an inch to move. It was a hard blow for Epstein, a man who for years had bent the law to his favor and now realized he had no more privileges or escapes. The next day, July 19th, public pressure paid off. Alex Acosta, that prosecutor who had done such a shameful job and was later rewarded as U.S. Secretary of Labor under Donald Trump, was forced to resign. A few days later, a series of highly unusual circumstances occurred. When Epstein was taken to jail, it was established that he would have a cellmate and that guards would check on him every 30 minutes. But the night of August 9th, his cellmate was transferred and no one took his place. Additionally, the guards fell asleep for nearly 3 hours and later falsified reports to cover it up. To top it off, 2 cameras in front of his cell stopped working and a third had damaged footage. The next morning, August 10th, while distributing breakfast, they found Epstein unconscious, in cardiac arrest. He was on his knees with a bedsheet tied around his neck. They took him to the hospital, where he was declared dead at 6:39 a.m. But even his death wasn't handled properly. They moved the body without treating the cell as a crime scene, as protocol demands, and didn't even photograph it as found. All these irregularities, the sleeping guards, falsified reports, malfunctioning cameras, ignored protocol, have fueled theories that Epstein didn't commit suicide but was eliminated. And that theory wouldn't be so far-fetched because his death certainly benefited many. Epstein had information on powerful men with money, influence, and a lot to lose if it all came to light. With his death, there'd be no trial, no more names, no more testimonies. The case could close without further consequences. And there's one more detail that raises doubts. Epstein was the first recorded suicide at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in 14 years. New York's chief medical examiner, Barbara Sampson, conducted the autopsy and concluded it was a death by hanging, the result of suicide. But Michael Baden, former city chief medical examiner, disagreed. Michael had worked on high-profile cases like the O.J. Simpson trial and the investigations into the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. According to him, the neck fractures were more consistent with strangulation than hanging. In fact, he stated that in over 1,000 prison suicides he'd reviewed, he'd never seen 3 fractures like those. He also noted the neck wound was centered, not under the jaw as typically occurs in hangings. The mark was thinner than the supposed bedsheet, and there was blood on the neck but not on the sheet. Other experts, including surgeons from Emory University Hospital, refuted this, arguing that such fractures can occur in suicides, especially in older people, because the hyoid bone is fragile. Additionally, 2 days before his death, on August 8th, Epstein signed his final will, which could indicate he was preparing to end it all. However, for others, this suggests he knew something was going to happen and wanted to settle everything beforehand. Did Epstein commit suicide, or did someone eliminate him? Epstein's story became media fodder not just for what he did, but for who was involved. Politicians, businessmen, celebrities. If it hadn't been for those high-profile names, who knows if anyone would have investigated or stopped him? Perhaps he'd still be doing it today. The harsh reality is that there are countless women living through the same thing. But since it doesn't happen on private islands or Manhattan mansions, rather in regular homes, offices, and schools, and since there are no celebrities or scandalous headlines, the abuse goes unnoticed. No one investigates, no one gets outraged, and no one stops it. According to the UN, nearly 1 in 3 women worldwide, about 736 million, has experienced physical or sexual violence at some point in her life. UNICEF estimates that over 370 million girls have been victims of sexual abuse in their childhood. In the United States, a sexual assault occurs every 68 seconds. In Mexico, in 2021 alone, 1.7 million sexual crimes against women were reported, equivalent to 243 incidents a day. However, these figures are just the tip of the iceberg because most victims never report it. It would be easy, and even comfortable, to label Epstein as a sociopathic, inhuman anomaly. But looking at the numbers, it's evident he wasn't an exception. However, as we saw earlier, people who cause harm aren't born that way. They may have poor emotional management, lack empathy, or dangerous impulses, but that alone isn't enough to become abusers. What seems more fundamental is that they cross a line and no one says anything. Cross another and are rewarded. Cross one more and realize they can do whatever they want without consequences. Because morality is learned. And today, with our silence, indifference, and the impunity we allow, what's often learned isn't empathy or respect, but that violence works and can be repeated without restraint. This is by no means a justification for what Epstein did. The responsibility for his decisions and actions lies with him. But if, as a society, we truly want to prevent cases like this from repeating, then we must change the conditions that make them possible.